You're listening to an Iroise podcast from the UCL Institute of Education, powered by UCL Minds.
So a very warm welcome from me, Professor Sue Rogers, Interim Director of the UCL Institute of Education. Thank you for joining us this evening, whether here in person or via the live stream. This is my first time as chair of our debate, so it's particularly exciting for me. Be gentle with me, please. I will keep our speakers to time and chair this tightly, and I'm looking forward to having a really lively debate, and I know from meeting the speakers that it certainly will be that. First of all, housekeeping. For tweeters, and I hope there will be some tweeting around this, there has been already, the hashtag is #IOE debates. And that's also the way that our live stream audience can put comments and questions to the panel. We're not expecting a fire drill, but if the alarm sounds, we will take the doors out onto Bedford Way. So, to the debate. As far back as Socrates, adolescents were marked out as a group and criticised by their elders for having bad manners. In more recent times, the dominant narrative regarding the teenager has been fairly consistent. The moody, awkward interloper who appears overnight on the child's 13th birthday. Stereotypes have been firmly reinforced in popular culture, the In-Betweeners sitcom, for instance, providing just one recent example. This is not the whole story, of course, as the history of teenagers and their remarkable achievements show us. And Greta Thunberg offers just one prominent current example of teenagers as a force for social awareness and transformative change. Our debate will no doubt cover the complexity, the many aspects of the teenager. But our starting point will be the unquestionable changes and challenges that the adolescent years present. What in practice could we do to ameliorate them? And how far should we go in this regard? Also, neuroscience has introduced new evidence to further our understanding of the adolescent years. But the science is relatively new. So we may look at where that evidence base is likely to head in the future. So on to our speakers. We have a fantastic panel tonight with expertise spanning education, school leadership, psychology, mental health, neuroscience, and much more. So in order of presentations, I'm going to introduce our speakers to you. Iroise Dumontheil is a reader in cognitive neuroscience at Birkbeck and a member of the Centre of Educational Neuroscience, which is a collaboration between the IOE, UCL and Birkbeck. She has won awards from the British Psychological Society and British Neuropsychological Society. Iroise's research interests include the development of social cognition and cognitive control during adolescence and the impact of cognitive training from computerized games to mindfulness, mediation, practice on adolescent cognition. Bettina Hohnen is a clinical psychologist who works with parents and teachers to align their understanding and behaviours with the developmental needs of young people. This involves taking the latest research evidence and translating what that means for day-to-day interactions. With those objectives in mind, Bettina recently published The Incredible Teenage Brain, Everything You Need to Know to Unlock a Teen's Potential, a book for adults supporting teenagers. Mark Lehain was until very recently Director of Parents and Teachers for Excellence. After a brief stint in the city, Mark trained as a mathematics teacher in 2002. He quickly rose up the ranks and in 2012 opened one of the first free schools, Bedford Free School, of which he was principal for 5 years. Since then, Mark has been campaigning for higher standards in our school system. And our final speaker, Mike Shooter, is a psychiatrist who has been working with children and young people and their families for over 3 decades. He was the first child psychiatrist to be elected as president of the Royal College of Psychiatrists and has been president, chair or trustee of many national organisations. He is an honorary fellow of 6 Royal Colleges and has advised governments internationally on the provision of services for young people. In 2018, he published Growing Pains, described by one reviewer as being a truly 3D picture of the struggles of growing up. So a warm welcome to our panellists. And without further ado, I'm going to pass to our first speaker. Each presenter will talk for 8 minutes, and then we will start the debate. So, thank you.
Okay, thank you. Good evening, everyone. Thank you for inviting me to take part in this debate. So I'll just start. The first question was, are teenage behaviours part of our biology or driven by our societal structures and practices? As a cognitive neuroscientist, I'm interested in biological mechanisms. However, I do not consider that the teenage brain exists in a vacuum. I believe it's important to consider the culture and society more broadly that the teenager is in. And if only because, as I'll talk about in a second, adolescents appear particularly sensitive to social and emotional influences that are kind of surrounding them. The definition of adolescence is already a mixture of both biology and culture. The start of adolescence is defined as, by a biological process, the onset of puberty. In contrast, the end of adolescence is defined as when an individual reaches an independent position in society, which is to a large extent culturally defined. So it's really got a mixture here. Another question, so are teenage behaviors a cultural artifact? The existence of a special development phase between childhood and adulthood, as was already mentioned, which we call adolescence or teenage years, is not a modern concept. Shakespeare and the ancient Greeks, like Socrates, already alluded to youth as having impulsive behaviors, but also recognized that it was a time during which individuals developed rational thoughts and were more able to make choices. Research on adolescent development from my lab and others have focused on the development of 3 key brain networks that are important during adolescence. So first, the limbic system. The limbic system is the network that responds to emotions and rewards. In adolescence, it shows greater emotional reactivity and responds to rewards in certain conditions than adults and in children. This is thought to be behind the increased emotional experience and increased sensation-seeking and risk-taking observed in adolescence and young adulthood. Second, there is the social brain network, which allows us to process social information, think about our own thoughts and those of others. Regions of the social brain are activated differently in adolescents than they are in adults. And adolescents have been found to show greater sensitivity to social interactions, for example, to social exclusion, and more susceptibility to peer influence, and they are less likely to take into account someone else's perspective. The last one is the cognitive control network. Cognitive control is what allows us to achieve our goals, resist distraction, plan, focus. These abilities and the brain regions that support them continue to improve until mid to late adolescence. This allows teenagers to increasingly focus, reason about abstract concepts, and resist impulses. However, one key problem of this research is psychological and cognitive neuroscience research has tended to focus on what we call Western, educated, industrialized, rich, and democratic, so weird for short, samples. So are all these findings specific to your weird samples? Does culture play a role in this kind of all these changes? Larry Steinberg, who is a researcher in the States, and colleagues have recently run a large study in more than 5,000 individuals aged 10 to 30 from 11 countries across the continents to try to address this question. And the results showed that overall there were kind of pretty consistent pattern of changes across all these different countries. In particular, they looked at sensation seeking and impulse control. But there were also some slight differences between countries, and we really don't know what these reflect and what would be kind of driving these differences. The abstract of tonight's event mentioned the start of the school day and the rise of social media as possible societal factors that may impact teenagers. Interestingly, these two examples, I think, may also impact adolescents, but also adults, through biological mechanisms in part. So if I start by the school day, adolescence is associated with changes in the body clock and sleep regulation systems, which lead to adolescents naturally falling asleep and getting up later. As the start of a school is fixed, this new rhythm can result in significant lack of sleep, which can in turn impact development, mental health, and cognitive functioning, and therefore learning. There have been attempts at implementing later start in school with some success in terms of the benefits experienced by pupils. However, large-scale tests have been prevented by practical difficulties in terms of timetables, the schedule of teachers, family, school buses. But of course, there are a lot of individual differences. And adults who are night owls find the typical workday rhythm difficult for them too. And something to point out here is while cognitive neuroscience research has improved our understanding of teenage development, this has tended to focus on averages, and much more work needs to be done looking at individual differences and individual trajectories such as those encountered by Mike in his practice. Turning to social media has had a lot of bad press. It's important to flag that there is still very little known regarding how social media use may directly impact adolescents and their well-being and mental health. I worked on the study of cognition, adolescence, and mobile phones, SCAMP in short, which is led by epidemiologists at Imperial College. SCAMP is a longitudinal study of adolescents in Greater London, aiming to try to provide some evidence in this field. Very early results suggest that, first, although social media restricts use to people who are 13 years or older, in reality, 2/3 of the adolescents in our sample, aged 11 to 13, who had a smartphone reported using social media. Second, we found that greater use of social media across devices was associated with poor quality of life in female adolescents and more emotional behavioral problems in both genders. However, it's really difficult to disentangle cause and effect. It may be that greater social media use leads to displacement of key activities such as sleep, social interactions with family, homework, and that has negative consequences on well-being and mental health. Or it could be that those adolescents who are experiencing anxiety and stress or other mental health problems struggle to fall asleep and use their phones and other devices to distract themselves when they can't sleep. Or it's probably both as well. Another important point to make is that social behavior and social media have been found to reflect to some extent social behaviors in real life. For example, adolescents who have a strong supportive friendship network have been found to have positive social experience online, while adolescents experiencing bullying may also experience bullying online. Having said that, the potential anonymity and lack of consequences of online bullying and negative interactions online may increase the frequency of these events compared to real-life context, but we need a lot more research on this. The last question was, what could we do to smooth the transition to adulthood? First, as a cognitive neuroscientist, and based on some of the research that has been done on this, I would argue that providing adolescents, their parents, and their teachers with some insight into the changes occurring in adolescents' brain may allow them to take a step back and try to approach sensitive situations with a different perspective. And Bettina and her colleague in her recently published book give a number of pointers on how to do this. Second, I mentioned adolescents' improving ability to reason. With appropriate scaffolding by parents and teachers, adolescents may be able to develop strategies to cope with adversity, with negative peer influence, in addition to being able to reason about abstract maths and philosophical concepts. Fostering adolescents' reflection and metacognition, so the thinking about thinking, is therefore thought to be key. Third and last, fostering good sleep and exercise, so going back to kind of more lower level neuroscience research, they are also key to good cognitive functioning. So parental, societal, educational efforts to improve these will be beneficial. Developing these skills, strategies, and good habits should allow adolescents to better cope with the challenges and demands of adulthood.
Thank you very much. So I pass to our second speaker, Bettina.
Thank you. As a clinical psychologist and as a parent myself, I've had an intimate window into the minds and the lives of teenagers and adults who are raising and educating them. And what I've learned from this is, and from studying the field of neuroscience, is that this can be and often is a confusing and challenging time. But what I've also learned that if we collectively manage this developmental stage, the rewards both for the individual and for the society are vast. Think for a moment about the purpose of the teenage years. Adolescence is this time of transition from childhood, a dependent state, to adulthood, an independent state. It could be thought of as society's graduation program for the adults of the future. The question then becomes, in order to graduate with honours, what do teens need to master, as well as what are teens trying to do? I'm not suggesting that the world should revolve around teens, but how about this as a question? What if teachers, mentors, parents, and teens themselves understood these developmental tasks and knew how best to support teens in their quest to become the best adults they can be? Now, that's a question worth asking. So let's look for a moment at this period of life and what we know. So we know, first thing we know about the adolescent brain, what brain science is teaching us is that there is this perfect coupling of nature and nurture that takes place in the form of sensitive periods for learning. So the human brain seeks out certain experiences at different times in development so that our brains cleverly get us in the right place at the right time, depending on which aspect of ourselves or our environment we are trying to learn, just when the brain is most open to learning. So evidence which converges from science, neuroscience and psychology teaches us that teens are focusing on three important aspects of the environment. The first is the social world, and this is obvious for anyone who's spent time with teens or anyone who's been a teen. Teen attention is drawn towards peers as they are trying to socially integrate. The question, where do I fit in, is a central pastime for the teenager. With that, social isolation becomes the driving force of behaviour. Social inclusion becomes the driving force of behaviour. And research shows us that social isolation is most detrimental at this stage. Loneliness is felt most acutely at this age, and friendship quality is strongly related to resilience and mental health later in life. So all that time on the phone and out with friends is not just flitting time away wastefully. Cracking the social code and finding out who we want to spend our lives with takes a long time. The second big focus of this time of life revolves around the question, who am I? How am I different or the same as other people? And our differentiated sense of self is slowly constructed, and it's strongly shaped by what happens to us in the teenage years and the feedback that we get from others. Adolescents try on different identities to see if they fit. That hairstyle, that hugging crop top, or that role as the perfect student versus the one who challenges authority at every opportunity. So there is a certain degree of self-absorption which is necessary at the same time that young people, they can also become highly sensitive to feedback from others. And then finally, this period of life is where people work out, what do I believe? Growing up involves separating from parents, and that project often begins quite abruptly and sometimes quite cruelly, causing teens to challenge adults in a way that they haven't seen before. But we need to remember that this is a reassuring marker of normal development. Teens are biologically driven to question what adults ask them as they begin to realize that adults are fallible, and try to work things out for themselves. They need to question us, to disagree with us, and at times to be aggravated by us. Attempts to dictate to adolescents are futile and often counterproductive. And moreover, research shows that they're far more likely to listen to their peers than they are to adults when they're making decisions. So these are the three important developmental tasks, but the clever thing about biology is that to facilitate this learning and enable these tasks to be completed, the teen brain is on a particular setting during this time. So the child brain and the adult brain function slightly differently to the teenage brain. There are, again, three aspects that stand out. First of all, it's well known that teenagers generally take more risks. But we're realizing that nature has done this for a reason. It's helpful for teens to be driven to new things when there are so many new challenges to overcome. They need to leave home, they need to have their first sexual experience, they need to start their first job, but also having a brain on a high-risk-taking setting puts the brain on a fast learning setting. If we're taking risks, we're exploring and we're learning. And this is a good thing when neuroplasticity is at its highest. And when we look at this, we realize we need to shift our bias in seeing risk-taking as inherently negative. Risk-taking can also be positive. If a teen puts himself up for a part in a school play, if they raise their hand in class, and indeed if they lead a worldwide movement against global warming, this is a risk because the outcome is unknown. They could be rejected, they could get laughed at, they may fail, but these kinds of positive risks are crucial. And a risk-averse teen is limiting their cognitive growth. Teenagers are often the instigators of social change and would often call out the nonsensical status quo. They have brains that allow us to grow generation on generation. Secondly, the teen brain is on a setting of high emotions and strong motivations. It's a time when we fall in love with someone or something. And again, we think that the reason is because feelings are a quick way to learn for young people, and they need to learn quickly if they're going to survive. And then finally, this frontal lobe of the brain is in its stage of fine-tuning, the seat of higher-order problem-solving and abstract thought, which is an ingenious design when the young person needs to problem-solve by themselves and take the reins. So I ask again, if we ask, what if teachers and mentors and parents and teens themselves understood these developmental tasks? What would be different? There would be a change in our perception of what is driving common teen behaviours, thinking about the social drive, the self, and the need to push up against us. A change in the way adults engage with teenagers, for example, talking to teens in a way that respects their need for status and respect, capitalises on peer-to-peer learning, changes the way we structure the environment, for example, taking into account the social focus rather than fighting against it in the classroom, allowing for more choice in education and a room for young people to challenge us, debate and problem solve. Change the way we think of risk, embrace it and support it, obviously while keeping teens safe, but offering high arousal stimulation experiences for learning. And changing the way adults support and respond to teen emotional highs and lows by improving structures of emotional learning and ensuring teens can put words into feelings into words. And hitching a ride on the mighty motivation of the teenage brain to propel young people onto a successful trajectory for intellectual stimulation. If there's one big message to come out of neuroscience, it's the importance of adult-teen relationships. Supportive, constructive, and positive adult-teen relationships are the basis of a first-class honours graduation to adulthood. Is this achievable? Absolutely. Indeed, it's happening in schools and in homes across the country, but we do need to change the prevailing narrative. Stereotypes of grumpy teens limit the expectations that adults have and teens have of themselves. We need to embrace the changes we see in teenagers, work with the biology, and consistently educate to unleash the incredible potential of this time of life.
Thank you, Bettina, and our speakers brilliantly to time so far. Let's see if we can keep that going.
God, no pressure.
So,
Speed talking.
I'm going to turn now to our third speaker, Mark.
So it's a bit of a running joke with my friends that whenever I do any talks about education, I always have to first of all refer to the fact that I've got 4 daughters of my own. But actually it does feel appropriate that I refer to my 4 girls because they're aged 6, 10, 11 and 13. And so although even though I've been a secondary school teacher and worked in schools for just under 20 years, nothing is quite like having that teenage creature in your own house. As I say creature affectionately. And I'm holding this lovely little bracelet that my youngest made me when they went to Bletchley Park recently. And I'm only sharing it with you because I like to wear it because it reminds me I'm a dad. But it reminded me that literally within 5 minutes of my 6-year-old giving me this lovely bracelet she made, which says Daddy in Morse code, the 13-year-old had told me to drop dead, as she does regularly. So what I decided was that when I was up here talking to you, there's no point in me, I can't add anything to what these guys, these experts in their fields can add. What I can do is draw upon my experience working with teenagers, like I said, for just under 20 years. It's like I've been able to conduct thousands of focus groups over that time, whether it's in maths lessons that I taught or as a head teacher for 5 years or what have you. And actually, I have really positive views about the teenage years. Having worked with teenagers for years, I think the public perception about teenagers is generally unfair. But actually, I do think there are some views that the media or society more widely might hold about teenagers which are not accurate. Because in my experience, and I've gone away and I wanted to check with my own views, matched the kind of stuff that came up. with like the British social attitudes data. There's been some really interesting stuff in there about younger people's views. And also the government, about 5 or 6 years ago, had what they called a horizon scanning programme looking at views of young people. And contrary to what a lot of people might think, my take, and those projects seem to back it up, I would say most teenagers are not actually radicals. They're pretty small c conservative about most things. They're really keen on society and the state addressing the issues that they really care about. They're also pretty classical liberal in terms of live and let live. They're that interesting combination that most of us are of different things. And so what I thought to myself was, if we extended or changed the franchise, the voting franchise, and there's talk about should we give it to 16-year-olds, what if we just only gave the vote to 12 to 19-year-olds? Okay, so the political world really did just revolve around teenagers. What differences might we see? And I just thought I'd give you 4 examples of policies that I think would very quickly come into being if we did indeed just give the vote to 12 to 19-year-olds. I'm pretty clear that within week 1, they would legislate to ensure that the secondary school day did indeed start later. It doesn't matter what group of pupils I've worked in. I've worked in affluent secondary schools dealing with affluent cohorts of children. The school I set up, Bedford Free Schools, in one of the poorest wards in England. My own girls, who I like to think are pretty keen on school and swattish, they're consistently keen on starting the school day later. They're also quite keen that the school day finishes when it finishes now as well. But I think that would be legislated within probably the first 24 hours of any new government coming in. The really interesting thing is, how would we encourage the voters, these 12 to 19-year-olds, to recognise that secondary schools have to fit in within that network of schools? The fact that primary school children probably need to start school earlier, the fact that parents need to get to work, what to do about before school and after school care and stuff like that. I'm not sure, given that we know teenagers are high on emotions and have strong motivations, I'm not sure quite how we convince them to bear that in mind, but that would definitely be a policy that will come in. I also think, and I'm being deliberately a little bit provocative given where I am and given the proud history of the IOE, I actually think if we gave teenagers more control over how schools were organised, I actually think they'd be a lot more traditionally organised than progressive educational thinking would have. I think there would be less TikTok. Have I got that right? Yeah, less TikTok and social media-based lessons, and actually far more traditional learning for a variety of reasons. Not just my own experience of having opened a school that is very traditionalist, and that is doing really, really well within a community that traditionally hasn't had high educational outcomes, but just because teenagers are strongly motivated, they love challenges, and I do sometimes wonder, this is a genuine question, is it our own adult ideas about what teenagers want that's driving the educational system traditionally? And actually, if we left teenagers to it, I think they would be advocating rigorous exams, rigorous curriculums, and so on and so forth. I'll let you think about that. If we now move on to more broad policy areas, I think if we gave the vote to 12 to 19-year-olds, I think Priti Patel would very quickly be seen as a softie when it came to the Home Office, because I think they're really hardline on law and order. If you get teenagers talking about right and wrong, whether it's crime on the streets or discipline in schools, and given that I'm normally the sort of token Tory in a room, it never ceases to surprise me how hardline they are about discipline and law and order. It makes me feel like a lily-livered liberal, actually. It's quite reassuring talking to them. So I think we'd very quickly see a massive increase in the number of police on the streets, alongside youth clubs and all that kind of stuff. And I think they'd be quite blunt about it. And finally, this was something that particularly came out when the British Social Attitudes did a particular drill into teenagers and young people's views in, I think, 2012, 2013. Younger people tend to be, and this did surprise me that the evidence was there beyond my own anecdote, they do tend to be more keen on liberal economics. And I know that people like Liz Truss and others in the Tory party recently have been making the case that actually young people are a lot more economically liberal than we might generally get the impression that they are, because often in the press it is the young momentum activists or the environmental activists who tend to be very left of centre. Actually, from talking to young people over the years and from doing the reading up that I've done for tonight, I wouldn't be surprised if we gave the vote to 12 to 19-year-olds. We saw the minimum wage scrapped. I think we probably see less spending on welfare because actually younger people's attitudes towards welfare spending are more centre-right than older generations are. And that's because young people now often complain they can't get jobs. They've been priced out of the job market. There was some stuff recently about the collapse in the proportion of teenagers that have part-time jobs. There's a whole load of reasons why that may be, but there is no doubt that the minimum wage has priced teenagers out of the jobs market. And a lot of the ones that I've spoken to over the years want those jobs, want those part-time jobs to have their own money and have their independence. But the other thing I think we'd see if we unleashed teenagers on economics, I think we'd see food prices rocket. Because actually they're quite big on the sugar tax, they're massive on animal welfare standards, and so I think you'd probably see the cost of food going up because animal welfare in the food industry would probably be raised. And I just think it's a really, really interesting mix. So there we are. If we give the vote to 12 to 19-year-olds, I think we would be a mix of Trump and Justin Trudeau in this country. What can we give them as adults, the grumpy old gits? I think the two things we could give them to help them make those decisions would be the gift of perspective, because now I'm officially old because I'm 41. Often the thing I remember not having as a young person with those high emotions and those strong motivations was the sense that how things are now is how they're always going to be, and we know as we get older that things will get better. And the final thing I think I'd urge them to think about is the need to flex with life, not just that the world revolves around you, but sometimes you need to fit in with the world. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mark, and plenty of food for thought, I think, developing from our speakers so far. And in our final presentation, I turn to you, Mike.
Thank you. Do you mind if I walk up and down? I find it very difficult to sit and talk at the same time. I can confidently tell you that I am the only member of the panel who's got teenage grandchildren. Okay?
But I will keep you to time.
You will.
You won't be able to see the countdown.
The other side of Christmas, I was delivering a talk to the final afternoon of a teenage conference, and they were knackered. They'd been on a fun run that afternoon, dressed as Santa Claus and pixies and fairies, and all they wanted to do was go home and crash out. So it wasn't going very well, until one of the pixies at the back of the room stuck her hand up and said, "Sir, what do you think about women and masturbation?" I said, "I try not to think about it too much, but I'm sure it's absolutely wonderful." But that bit of repartee symbolised for me why I've always loved dealing with teenagers, with adolescents. I love their sense of surprise, never know quite, as a teacher or a psychiatrist or a psychologist or whatever, you never know quite what they're going to say next or what they're going to do next. I love the directness of their challenge. You will discover, if you haven't already discovered, that they don't want to know you as a professional. They want to know you as a person, what you believe in and what you think. And woe betide you, because they will unerringly home in on the bit of unresolved stuff from your teenage years. And I love the fact that they're right on the brink of all sorts of changes, which I'm not going to talk about because these good people have already done so. So really the question is not what if, but the world does revolve around teenagers, and we have to ask ourselves, what are they supposed to be about, and how can we help them if things are going wrong? I'm going to talk to you just a little bit about emotional health as one aspect of that. And the problem with emotional health is that politicians especially had all sorts of ideas about what it is without truly understanding it. David Cameron, if you remember him, he thought it was to do with happiness, and he created something called a happiness index. And I noticed that Lord Layard and his cronies are researching not far from here into happiness clinics and happiness group therapy and so on. That worries me, because teenagers classically slop around amongst all sorts of other disturbing emotions like anger and misery and fear. And if somebody tells them they're supposed to be happy all the time, that heaps coals of fire of guilt on their head. Other politicians have equated emotional health with material health. So if we eradicate material poverty in the world, then everybody's going to be happy. Not so. The equation is not so simple. Some of the most well-adjusted families that I have worked with, and well-adjusted teenagers in them, have been living in poverty-stricken sink estates at the top end of the old mining valleys in South Wales. And some of the most difficult families that I've worked with have been middle-class professional families with a huge mortgage to support, everybody working flat out, nose to the grindstone, no time for sleepovers and just messing about and hanging out with your mates. And that's awful for teenagers. So what is it? Well, I'm going to offer you my definition, which revolves around a number of C's. First of all, control. Learning about your own feelings and being able to control them and adjust to them. Secondly, communication. How do you communicate those feelings in an appropriate manner to your peer group and adults around you? And thirdly, having done that, how do you strike a compromise? How do you work out a compromise between yourself and what you want out of life and a peer group who may want something totally different? And fourthly, having done that, how do you then cooperate with each other towards some sort of shared goal? Fifthly, risk. Doesn't begin with C, but how do you conquer risk? Yeah? How do you find the confidence in yourself to tackle risk as a teenager? Because if you don't learn how to tackle risk now, as an adolescent, how on earth are you going to cope with risk amongst the vicissitudes of later life? And finally, as a C, how about course? Adolescence is round about the sort of time when we begin to realize what we want out of life, where we're going, and how can we possibly get there. Now that's all very positive. You know, and I know, the panel knows, that life isn't that positive for a lot of teenagers. And if I had time, I'd take you through layers of the onion, but you've already been through some of them. Beginning on the outside with the social attitudes towards teenagers. And then inside that, educational attitudes and choices in teenagerhood. And thirdly, inside that, peer groups. And fourthly, inside that, parents. And right at the core, the thing that I've always been interested in is the single teenager, the single adolescent in trouble. And what can we offer them rather than what the world wants of them? I did write a book a couple of years ago, Growing Pains. And essentially, it's a compendium of stories. It's the stories that young people and their families and carers have brought to me over several decades in South Wales. Stories of distress from all sorts of walks of life. Some kids who are struggling with family breakdown. Some kids who are struggling with abuse. Some kids struggling with bullying. Some with disabilities they were born with or have developed. Some struggling with chronic illness. Some struggling with major cataclysmic events in their life, like bereavement. What they have all required is the time and the space with someone they've learned to trust, to explore those stories and find different ways of ending them, to find the power to deal with those sorts of problems in their life. I can't promise them in the future a life without pain, a life without problems. Life simply isn't like that. But I can help them find power within themselves to tackle those problems when they meet them. One final thing to say, that's me as a professional being paid to see young people. But remember, when you become teachers, or whatever you're going to become, it takes just one positive relationship to change a teenager's life around. If they remember you as Mrs. or Mr. whoever you are, who treated them differently, who treated them as somebody worth knowing in their own right, then when they're next on the brink of trouble, they will remember that and be life enhanced. So good luck, all of you, because the future of our teenagers rests in your hands.
Thank you very much, Mike. And thank you to all of our speakers. So, first, first, we have a little bit of time. I'm going to ask the speakers to respond to one another. But I picked up a few things along the way. I mean, I personally am prepared to admit I was, by all accounts, a very difficult teenager. So some of the things that have been said tonight really resonate for me. Perhaps not the getting up late, because I've always been an early riser. So that's a really interesting one. And I think all of our speakers sort of touched on that in different ways. So my question, just as an opener to the panel, is, on balance, do teenagers really need a later start to the day? Or are the calls for a later start to the day just a bit of a first world problem? So can we have some responses on that? And then perhaps you'll have questions for each other.
I mean, I would just say, no, they don't, because one of the important things we have to learn as we grow up is that we have to fit in around the rest of society around us. And generally speaking, most of us have a working day that starts some point between 8 or 9, half 9. And teenagers have to fit in with their family and their community. And so school days are generally start and finish where they do, generally because that's how long you need to get the learning done. And that fits in with their family and their community around them.
Thank you. And from a scientific point of view?
Well, I think the jury's still out, because basically we're still struggling because of these societal constraints. We're not managing to run these studies to actually see whether there is kind of a strong impact or not. And so I think scientifically we're lacking the evidence to kind of demonstrate that. I mean, there's the evidence that their biological clock changes during adolescence on average, because there are individual differences. But really, whether a half an hour or an hour difference would be enough and kind of really change their day and their ability to learn during that day, I think we really don't have the data. But I think kind of compromise is things like, the older children, the older adolescents might be independent enough that they don't need to leave at the same time as their parents and everyone else. And so there's kind of things around that's kind of what's being trialed in some schools.
Thank you.
I mean, one of the things that we talk about in the book actually is the fact that there is this biological change there, but actually it's maybe only a tiny part of what is causing teenagers to be sleep deprived. And actually a significant thing is the phone. And not because teens are addicted to their phones, but they are addicted to their friends. And a lot of the friend stuff goes on at nighttime. And if teenagers have their phones in the bed at nighttime, they're not sleeping. And I have to say, I'm not a very particularly prescriptive kind of clinician as a whole, and I am fairly liberal and very positive about teenagers, but there's one thing I do think would help the whole population would be not to have your phones in bed at night time.
Can I just ask at that point, what happened before we had phones? I mean, and certainly for myself and others,
yes,
we had books and things to do, and
telly. You watched the telly or not?
Well, you were lucky. I didn't have a telly. But I mean, do you see a change then? I mean, what? I mean, sleep deprivation has been around for a long time.
Yes, that's a good point.
Mike, you.
I wanted to pick up loads of things about education, especially, but I mean, from that point of view, I just remember when my teenagers were sitting around the breakfast table, looking dopey and miserable and kicking the cat and so on. I'm thinking, Christ, I'm glad I haven't got to teach that lot this morning. But in Wales, we have given the vote to 16-year-olds, and we've done a lot of talking with teenagers about what they would like out of the educational system. And I have to say they would like, they would like the whole educational system to start later, and it is going to in Wales. It's going to start with play down at the bottom end of the primary school. The hours are going to be later, and the curriculum has totally changed in that relationships are now one of the 6 major subjects, along with maths and English and so on. And they will be looked at as far as that's concerned. I think the problem with the educational system is it's based on what we want out of teenagers. We treat them as sort of economic investment units for the future, instead of saying, what are they supposed to be learning about themselves and about the world and about the peer group around them?
Lots of heads nodding at that last point, and I think for me there's also the point, with the climate change movement at the moment, and are they actually carrying a burden that we should be much more engaged in as adults? I mean, it's a very complex issue about how teenagers are constructed currently, I think. So any other points you want to ask each other at this point? Responses to one another's paper before I open it to the floor?
I like very much what you were talking about, or you were verging on talking about parents. I think parenting is the most difficult job in the world, and we get precious little training in it.
Yeah.
But I think of all the parenting adolescents, apart from 2-year-olds, it's just about the most difficult aspect. And it involves, I think, walking a tightrope between laissez-faire on the one side, especially around social media, and being over-restrictive on the other, in both cases in which teenagers, as a reaction, will behave in more and more dangerous ways. Most parents can walk that tightrope with the odd trip every now and again, but it's incredibly easy to fall off the tightrope, and then things are really difficult.
And I was just going to say, and when you're trying to balance it, again, so I'm just thinking about my own experience, when you've got that 6-year-old and that 13-year-old, and the way to handle that 13-year-old will be very different to that 6-year-old, but the 6-year-old is watching the 13-year-old and the interactions there, or vice versa. How many of you are the oldest in your... Okay, and you had it toughest, didn't you? Your parents were much stricter on you. How many of you in here were youngest? And you got away with everything, didn't you?
I disagree. I'm the middle child, and that's the most difficult position to be in.
And as a maths teacher, I was always convinced that fractions and division was only invented because of siblings. You know, like when you're sharing out the cake or the sweets, who gets the right amount? So it is very, very difficult. And as teachers, often we were having to play peacemakers when family stuff would come in.
We clearly need another debate about siblings and position in the family. I want to open it out to the floor fairly soon. Any final comments from me?
I suppose the only thing we haven't really touched on is individual differences, which are enormous, and we're talking about teenagers as a whole group.
Yeah.
And particularly when you're thinking about education and neurodiversity, I think that really needs to be part of the debate.
It does, and I've had a number of young people who I've seen in the past whose parents have thought they were strange and pathological when they were just different.
Yeah.
They had different personalities from the ones they'd already had.
Yeah.
But that's okay, teaching parents is part of the job.
Yeah.
So maybe we can explore that a bit further with the audience. Do we have any teenagers here tonight? I hope... Oh, great. Well, we'd love to hear from you. And I hope there will be lots of teenagers live streaming, because I think it's, it's really important to get their views and perspectives on this. And so welcome to any teenagers out there. We'd love to hear from you. This is where we open it up to you in the audience. We've touched on things like voting age, sleep, deprivation. Hopefully that's triggered some thoughts for you. The microphone is ready and roving. Thank you, Kate. So, yes, please, at the back.
Yes, it's on. Thank you very much. I found that really, really interesting. I work in careers education, and I would be very interested to hear how, or if, you think that some of the kind of teen-specific developments that we've talked about this evening can be applied to careers education in school, or the way that teens can access the world of work, and whether we need to change our approach in that way.
So is this for the whole panel? Shall we just hear from all of them?
Yeah, I think that would be
Anybody like
great.
to start?
I think maybe I'll start. I think it's a really tricky question, because the way school is structured at the moment is very academically focused, and in a lot of European countries there is a kind of bad reputation for more practical kind of courses, which actually might be beneficial. And we've kind of discussed a little bit about dropping out of school during teenage years before kind of this meeting started. And actually it might be a phase because you want to explore other things. You might not want to just sit in a class. And so there are kind of ideas potentially where having this possibility to actually start work and maybe return to university. So I work at Birkbeck, later education, return later at a time when you're more ready. That's something that maybe we should keep in mind and be more open about it. And I'm sure that I would probably have the same if my son suddenly said, I want to quit school when he's 15. I'd be like, what? But I think we need to kind of maybe be more open about this. And in terms of practical, like the skills you learn at school, I don't know if you've heard, but the Montessori school system, I mean, they also have adolescent version where I believe it's something like running a farm. And so they have to practically think about planning and organizing. And so it involves lots of kind of math skills and kind of planning skills, but in a useful way, and with animals that need you, and you actually have kind of a purpose. So I think it's like there's quite a lot of things to kind of think about in terms of these options.
Thank you. Mark, did you want to add anything to that?
I don't think, and please don't take this the wrong way, I don't think we're ever going to get careers education right in our schools. And I'll tell you why, because I don't think the purpose of schooling is about the jobs market in the future. And I think that will be an outcome of a good education. I think the purpose of education is to immerse children in the best that has been thought, said and done. As a result of that, they will be able to, over time, form their views about things they're passionate about, what they want to do. I have to say, and I know not everyone will agree with me on this, I think actually since 2010 we've had a government that have embraced more the idea of education in the classical liberal sense, and you very rarely hear a government minister now talk about teenagers as economic units, because they don't believe in that. It was a very Blairite managerialist thing that crept in, where that's why they're so big on the vocational qualifications being rolled out and preparing kids for work. That is not what Nick Gibb and Michael Gove and those guys are about. You might not agree with the kind of things they want on the curriculum, but they're very clear. The purpose of curriculum is to immerse kids in the best that's been thought, said and done for its own beauty and purpose, not for economic reasons. And hence, that's why careers education, I think, probably comes later. I'm 41. I still don't know what I want to do when I grow up. That's not to say careers education isn't important. I just think it'll be really difficult to get it right because there's so many other things we have to squeeze into those 12,000 hours that young people have in school. And it's only 12,000 hours between the age of 4 and 16. And once you've put in your maths and your English and your enabling subjects and all the art, music, drama and the humanities, there's not a lot left, which is why one of the things I've been pushing for the last years is pushing back all the very important and well-meaning things people want to do in schools, because that's all young people are. I just think there's lots of other things we can be spending that time on.
Okay, so let's hold some of those thoughts. And any other comments for our question?
I belong to an era when I was allowed to change my mind about what I wanted to do umpteen times. And before I went into medicine, I was a lawyer and a historian, and I was a teacher briefly and a gardener, and I drove buses and did all sorts of other things, and was a newspaper reporter, and finally sort of staggered into medicine as a sort of relief from everything else. But I just wonder whether that would be allowed anymore, lifting it out of school. But when kids have left school, are they really going to be allowed to wander the world in that sort of way and discover what they really want to do with their life? Or are they going to be told they have to get their nose to the grindstone and get a job as soon as it's offered? I also wonder about what's happening in families where, certainly in a lot of the poverty-stricken areas of South Wales, there are no jobs. There are no jobs at all. And we're into families with a third generation who've never had a job. And what that has in terms of how you feel about education. And there's no flats to go to and no university to go to. You're living with your parents.
Thanks, Mike.
So what does that do?
Yes, what does that do indeed? And did you want to comment?
I agree. I think it's changed over time, and I think when we were younger, the expectations, what you needed to kind of get into university were very different. I certainly, you could get a 2E offer in my day. Now everyone's expected to get A's. So if you're not successful, what are the pathways for you these days? And it really comes back to that issue of neurodiversity, actually.
It does, yes.
And individual differences. And
yes. And as someone who dropped out of school and then someone took a punt on me to go to university in my early 20s, mid-20s, it demonstrates that it's never too late, and I'm eternally grateful for that support and mentorship. And I think that's another really important factor for our young people, that they have good mentors to work with. Did you want to come back briefly, or should we move on? Are they to different questions? Or okay. I think you had your hand up first. Thank you.
I think that mental health problems are really quite common among teenagers, and it's probably on the rise. Yet the support is very limited. I think the children's and adolescent mental health services are so overwhelmed that it's really difficult to know how to help teenagers who have problems, for instance, with anxiety and things like that. So is there anything happening with the government that is trying to change this, and what the parents can do meanwhile to help people who have teenagers who have these problems?
Come and live in Wales. I mean, I could talk for hours about this. The traditional setup is that we have teenagers on the one hand with an increasing number of problems, struggling with all sorts of stresses in their life, and self-harming and so on. And on the other, we have a traditional sort of child and adolescent mental health service with a formal system of referral and waiting lists that get longer and longer, so the kids are self-harming on the waiting list and parents are going absolute crackers and so on. That has to change. And I regret to say that the Westminster government's past attitude has been throw money at it and to boast about it. All that will do is temporarily relieve the waiting list, and then it will build up again. We have to have a totally different way of thinking about teenage problems and how we should deal with them. And that doesn't rely on stuffing people into diagnoses which they don't warrant or fobbing them off with a pill. It's about the sort of relationship that I was talking about early on. And that doesn't mean, if I'm working in a multidisciplinary service, that all of them have to meet a child psychiatric consultant first, because that's how waiting lists develop. But it should be dependent on skills and character and interests and so on. And if a multidisciplinary team is working well, then you won't have those waiting lists. You won't have them. You know, I operated in that way in one of the most poverty-stricken areas of South Wales. And you know, my load went down, not up.
Thank you,
because people saw other people in the team who were most appropriate.
Thank you. And anything to add to that for the question?
Well, certainly the Anna Freud Centre has got an incredible programme. They've just got a lot of funding, and they're going around, they're training teachers, primary schools and in secondary schools. So I think there are a lot more roles, I think, these days. So I think there's a lot more thinking about early intervention and preventative measures rather than, as well as waiting, until a young person has a mental health problem, but thinking about what else can we do to prevent young people becoming unwell in that way. So I think that is happening.
Yeah. We should just mention school counsellors, actually, because that's a huge new system. Every school in Wales, where I live and work, is now obliged to have a school counsellor. That's great, as long as it doesn't involve a school counsellor sitting in a room with school counsellor written outside and a row of chairs with poor kids sitting outside waiting to see them. It has to have a lot of confidentiality, and it has to have a lot of link up with other services. But not at the expense, school counselling not at the expense of your individual pastoral care as a teacher.
Thank you.
No saying, it's nothing to do with me, it's him down the road.
Yeah, so I'm going to move to the in the front here. Yes, thank you, Kate.
I'm a primary school trained teacher that's now working in further ed, so it's quite an interesting journey. At primary school age, children are desperate to take responsibility and to lead and have opportunities there, whereas in further ed, I specifically work in apprenticeships, and people assume that's just at 16 to 19. Well, actually, we're teaching 16s to 50-year-olds in the same room. And apprentices have 1 day a week off from their vocational training to study, and they are so resistant to taking responsibility in a study environment. And I just wanted to ask the panel what their views and advice are, where you've got this pedagogy of encouraging young people to study off the job, but they just don't want to meet deadlines, and they don't want to formalise their education, because what they want to focus on is the vocational.
So what's behind that? Who would like to? Bettina?
Well, I suppose it makes me wonder about the those young people's experience and whether they've had a difficult time in education and that's why they've ended up in a vocational path. And there is some trauma, small trauma, or very negative experiences of education. So there's some avoidance going on rather than not taking responsibility. You know, maybe reframe it as, you know, they're taking responsibility in a vocational way, and that has memories and where they have been very unsuccessful. So that means they're not keen to take part. I don't know, that's the thought I had.
Thank you.
Yeah, that's certainly the
Is that
case for
true?
some.
Yeah.
There's this complete mix, but you're absolutely right. That we have evidence for some, but then there are some that were very successful at school and they're still quite resistant.
Really?
I guess the only thing I'm thinking about is we all know that we wrongly have a perceived hierarchy as to routes that people take at 16. And the school I set up actually was literally just over the road from Bedford College, a brilliant FE college. We know that FE has for a long time been a forgotten part of our education system. It certainly isn't going to be, or certainly the mood music around it is that it's going to be getting a lot of extra investment and attention over the next few years to try and make up for that. But it's exactly as you said, often it's the experience of the people when they go on to different courses, and it's going to be so individual, isn't it? So individual. We used to try and work, the school I ran was an 11 to 16 school. We used to try and have very close links to the courses students went on to. But I'm afraid that, well, as we know, there's no magic wand, otherwise we'd have solved it by now, wouldn't we? So.
Thank you. And we have a question at the back.
Thank you. I work on self-harm research, and I wanted to ask a question about risk, which was brought up by a couple of members of the panel. And sometimes that was framed in terms of positive risks, I think. But obviously, there's a risk of self-harm in teenagers that we're all very aware of, and a theory that in schools that teenagers might have strong peer influences that might influence their own risk-taking behaviour. Thinking about particularly cognitive neuroscientific perspectives on risk-taking, what do you think are appropriate interventions to think about developing to address these theoretical peer influences?
So I think in terms of the self-harm, I'm not kind of the most qualified person, but there's one route that people have been trying to think about is to use the peer influence in a positive way. So those, so they are always in kind of school networks and social networks in the schools. They are the influencers. So now these days social media, but even before they are the influencers. And they found then a couple of studies where if you try, for example, I believe they were doing it for bullying. But if you do some training with the social influencers about, you know, what's bullying and how to prevent it and how it's like negative influence, etc., then they spread the message through the school better than, you know, if it was just the teachers doing it or the kind of head teacher, etc. So it's kind of trying to go through that social network to spread not a message of self-harm is good, but a message of, you know, what else could you do, or that, you know, what might be the supportive thing, but actually to use social networks in a positive way. I think that's kind of one thing I can kind of talk about.
I'd like to say two things. One is, in my day, you know, there were a lot of people who said you can't talk about sex in school because you'll spread it. You can't talk about alcohol because you spread it. And then you can't talk about self-harm because you spread it. Well, actually, you're far more likely to circumscribe it if you talk about it with a peer group, because there will be peers in that group who've tried it and it hasn't worked for them. And they will listen to their peers far more than somebody like ourselves sitting on a platform. But the second thing I wanted to say is there isn't such a global thing as self-harm. There are lots of different sorts of things behind self-harm. For some, it's a matter of sort of relieving tension, almost like menstruation. You know, cut yourself and the blood flows and the stress dies down, in which case we've got to find a better way of dealing with anxiety. In some, self-harm in some families is almost a way of life. You know, if you get angry with somebody, you go to the kitchen drawer and swallow everything that's inside it, and you end up on ITU with, you know, with amitriptyline in your bloodstream and a heart shivering all over the place. And then for some, of course, self-harm is a sign of deep-seated problems, and that needs a total way of accessing, not just talking about it with your peer group.
Before I bring Bettina in, we've actually had a comment from Dr. Emma Jane Kilford on Twitter. Risk aversion is commonly observed in studies of adolescent depression, and this can have a vicious cycle on learning and growth as a result. So that sort of segues quite well, I think.
Yeah.
And perhaps you'd like to comment.
Yeah, I think the kind of risk-taking that I'm talking about is not so much, wouldn't be related to self-harm. It's really, risk-taking is doing things where you don't know what the outcome is, trying new things more. And I think I would agree, and my understanding of self-harm is an expression of intense emotional distress. So I wouldn't call it risk-taking in that way, but this is quite an interesting comment, because I think a lot of the recent research is thinking about risk in a positive way rather than just a negative way. And actually, if we're taking risks, then we are challenging ourselves. And if you don't take risks, actually, you're not going to grow and you're not going to develop resilience. So, and there are people, I think, in education, and arguably our education system encourages a lack of risk-taking within education, because it's all about the grades, and rather than saying, why don't you try something, and if you fail, it's okay. And so I think you do have these young people that come out of education having never failed anything, having always kind of got A's and A's and A's, and then real life is not really like that, and that can be really hard, and they don't have the resilience, and you can see how maybe a mental health problem can be as a result of that.
Thank you. Can I push that back to the audience? Any other comments on that, or a new question? Yeah.
I'm not from the education background itself, I'm actually a scout leader. But our waiting lists have grown and grown over the last couple of years. One of the things we do, obviously, which schools are less able to do, is quite often some of the more extreme risks, if you like, in a sort of safer environment. You know, firelighting, the use of knives, rope bridges, various things like that, which could involve in sort of some mild harm if it's not done well. But actually, under a controlled environment and limiting the extreme risks, we've seen numbers of scouts increase dramatically over the last couple of years. And whilst I appreciate, obviously, it's not always possible to do that with an education system, certainly access to, or more of these scout groups growing could be a very good thing.
Can I?
Yeah, sure.
It's really important that, there's that saying, it takes a village to raise a child. Like, we must not lose sight of the fact that just because kids are not necessarily getting exposed to particular kinds of risks in school, that's not necessarily the school's job. They're only in school for a certain proportion of their life. Now, my wife organises, she teaches at the school I was at, every single year 7 goes up Snowdon at the end of year 7. And for a lot of those kids, that's the biggest physical, emotional challenge they've ever done. But that takes a huge amount of logistics to get to that point. There's 114 in the current year 7. They've got confirmation from 90 of them so far, and they're going up in July. So she's got another 24 kids to pin down, get the money out of them. And that's with the school organising everything. But it's incredible that they can do that. And so I think the contribution I want to make is that we must not assume that schools are the place to do it. It is the responsibility of families in the end, who have these children, to provide these opportunities for them.
But just to become a little controversial, please, it may be that children are only at school in the school day, but the amount of work we give them, there is very little time in their lives to do anything but schoolwork. So actually, I would argue that it is the role of schools to consider those things and think about developing the whole child.
Can I just add as a corollary to
You
that?
may.
I'm sorry to harp on about Wales. One of the organisations I chair is Play Wales, which is dedicated to free risk-taking play, not just in little kids, but in adolescents, young adults too. And I'm not a researcher, I haven't got a research brain in my body, but I do love the research that proves what I know is right. And it's just proved, in fact, that the area where risk-taking behaviour is most encouraged in teenagers is the most poverty-stricken areas of Wales. The middle-class professional areas that are dedicated to academia and work after school and keeping your nose to the grindstone hardly ever allow their kids to take risk-taking behaviour, and the consequences are awful.
Yeah.
Can I just say,
Yes,
the best weekend I've had in the last year, sorry it's anecdote, was taking my oldest two to a swimming gala in Kings Lynn and to watch them. Sophie and Rachel, also I shouldn't name them, they did 6 races each over 2 days and they lost every one. They came last in every single race. And it was brilliant because they do really well at school. They've got loads of lovely friends and it's really good. They love the swimming, they love the exercise, and also it's not a bad thing, is it, to not be brilliant at everything.
I'm moving on to this mic now. I mean, I would love a debate on play and work because it's one of those unresolved, and I've personally done quite a lot of work on play in early childhood, but I think that could be extended across the life course, actually, and I think it links very well with taking risks, and what that might help in terms of development. So we're kind of getting to the point where I need to report on our Twitter polls. Are there any burning last questions, or can I move on to that? You might not be aware, but we had a Twitter poll that went out a few days ago, and the question was, what trait was most noticeably more marked for you in your teens? Moodiness, impulsiveness, risk-taking, caving to peer pressure. I think I ticked impulsiveness. But moodiness has come out on top at 52.9%, with impulsiveness 13.8%, risk-taking 14.9%, and caving to peer pressure 18.4%. So interesting. We also put on Instagram a selection of admired teenagers. And I started, didn't I, by noting the really fantastic achievements of teenagers throughout history. And I think we should really hang on to that. And there's a question in my head about all these traits the kind of stereotype of the teenager. And is that why they can achieve so much? Because they have such open minds, such curiosity, such energy and drive, and lots of other qualities that maybe fade as we get slightly older, maybe a bit more cynical. So I'd like to think that we can be really positive about the achievements of teenagers, and certainly our Instagram followers have ranked them in this order. Coming out on top, Greta Thunberg, not surprising. But of course, she also represents a whole range of activists across the world, and I think we should acknowledge them also here. Kobe Bryant, for getting drafted into the NBA at 17. Of course, in the news, sadly, this week. Lyra Silvertongue, Philip Pullman's His Dark Materials. Some heads nodding there, probably more familiar than I am with it. Hermione Granger from Harry Potter. Kim Hanbin Aka B.I., South Korean rapper. Anybody familiar? I think I need to look that one up. And Mehmed the Conqueror. So quite a distinguished list, I think, of teenagers. Brilliant to see that. So there's been lots of engagement, I think, with the debate, and it's been fascinating for me, and I hope it's been a really stimulating set of presentations and discussion, and I hope you'll continue with this after you leave the room, either by contacting our brilliant speakers or on Twitter. I don't think we've answered all the questions, but we've certainly raised lots of questions. So I think it just leaves me to say thank you very much for being here, and thank you very much to our presenters, and let's show them our appreciation.
Thanks so much for downloading and listening to this IOE podcast. You can find more audio stories from the IOE on SoundCloud,